What happens when history's two greatest warlords go head-to-head? The man who conquered the known world versus the man who created the largest empire in history. Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan never met. But what if they had? Who had the better army, the smarter tactics, and the raw power to dominate the battlefield? One led from the front with a 16-foot spear. The other vanished into the steppe, only to strike like lightning days later. But here's the twist. Genghis Khan studied Alexander and criticized him. So who would actually win? And why did both empires collapse after their deaths? Let's discuss it in today's episode of TRS Clips. When you strip away the battles and the empires, what made Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan truly legendary was their leadership. But make no mistake, they couldn't have been more different in how they ruled, how they fought, and how they inspired or terrified the people around them. Alexander was charismatic, almost godlike in the eyes of his men. He was tutored by Aristotle, steeped in Greek philosophy, and believed in merging cultures. He wore Persian robes in Babylon, married foreign princesses, and pushed for a unified empire that blended East and West. On the battlefield, he led from the front, literally charging into combat alongside his soldiers. At the Battle of the Granicus, he was nearly killed, but kept fighting. His troops saw him as one of their own, and that loyalty helped him conquer lands from Greece to the Indus River, 11,000 miles in all. But he could also be impulsive and paranoid. In fits of rage or drunken fury, he executed close friends and even generals like Clytus the Black, who had once saved his life. Genghis Khan, on the other hand, ruled through fear, discipline, and brutal meritocracy. Born as Temujin, he clawed his way up from exile and slavery to unite the Mongol tribes. He didn't care about bloodlines, only loyalty and results. A stable boy could become a general if he proved himself. Mongol soldiers were organized, well-fed, and even had a field postal system. But when it came to enemies, ruthless. Entire cities were burned to the ground, millions slaughtered, all to break the will of resistance. Yet to his own men, he was fair, dividing spoils equally and punishing generals who abandoned soldiers in battle. And this is reflected in their army power. Before we move on to the next section, please don't forget to subscribe if you liked the video so far. Let's talk muscle, military muscle. Behind every legendary conqueror is an army that made it all possible. So who had the real edge when it came to the battlefield? Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan? Alexander's army was a war machine built for precision. His core infantry, the Macedonian phalanx, fought in tight formations wielding sarissas, gigantic 16-foot spears that created a living wall of iron. It was almost impossible to break through. And then there was his elite companion cavalry, heavily armored shock troops led by Alexander himself, capable of crashing through enemy lines like a wrecking ball. On top of that, Alexander brought along engineers who could construct massive siege towers, battering rams, and catapults, allowing him to smash through city walls across Asia and the Middle East. In just 10 years, he conquered over 18,000 miles, from Greece all the way to India. But then you've got Genghis Khan, the storm from the east. His army wasn't built for brute force. It was a symphony of speed and strategy. Mongol warriors carried composite bows and could fire accurately while galloping at full speed, basically turning the battlefield into a shooting gallery. Each rider had a string of 3 to 5 horses, allowing them to ride non-stop for days without tiring. And if that's not enough, Genghis mastered psychological warfare. He didn't just defeat enemies, he crushed their spirits. Entire cities were wiped out to send a message: surrender or face annihilation. Over 25 years, Genghis's armies conquered more than 25,000 miles, creating the largest contiguous land empire in history. Alexander brought discipline and innovation. Genghis brought mobility and terror. Two armies, two radically different styles of war. Speaking of which, when it comes to battlefield tactics, both Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan weren't just good, they were terrifyingly brilliant. These weren't just warriors, They were chess masters playing with thousands of lives on a board that spanned continents. Let's start with Alexander. His signature move? The hammer and anvil. His phalanx, the anvil, would lock enemy forces in place, those 16-foot sarissas pressing forward like a wall of death. Then came the hammer, his elite companion cavalry slamming into the flanks at full speed. It was a textbook tactic he used to devastating effect at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where he defeated a Persian army that outnumbered him nearly 5-1. He also used psychological bait, feigned retreats like at Arbela to lure enemies out of position. And here's the thing. He didn't command from the rear. He led charges himself, sword in hand, in the thick of the chaos. That kind of leadership inspired total loyalty and absolute fear in his enemies. But Genghis Khan took deception to an entirely new level. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, he lured a Rus army over 60 miles into a trap using a false retreat. Not just a few minutes of running away like Alexander, but days of it. When the Rus forces were exhausted and scattered, the Mongols turned and annihilated them. His armies attacked in waves in what's been called a two-man avalanche, 10,000 strong units charging in fluid, shifting formations. And Genghis didn't guess his enemies' moves, he knew them. His spy networks infiltrated enemy courts, religions, and tribes. He fought battles before they even began. For all their brilliance, even the greatest conquerors had flaws. Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan both seemed unstoppable, but neither conquered the entire known world. So what held them back? Alexander's biggest strength, his personal charisma, was also his downfall. His army followed him because they loved him, not necessarily his vision. When he died suddenly in Babylon at just 32 years old, everything unraveled. He had no clear heir, no plan for who would rule after him. His generals, called the Diadochi, carved up the empire into pieces, launching decades of civil war. His dream of a unified empire from Greece to India collapsed almost overnight. And while he was busy fighting in Asia, back home in Greece, rebellions started bubbling. He had conquered fast, but he never really secured what he left behind. Genghis Khan, by contrast, ruled longer, until age 65, and built an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. But his brutal methods bred deep hatred. Cities that resisted were annihilated, sometimes tens of thousands executed in a single day. That kind of fear worked short-term, but it made long-term governance nearly impossible in some regions. His empire also became dangerously stretched. Managing territories across China, Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe was a logistical nightmare. And while Genghis had a sharp military mind, he never tried to culturally unify his empire. There was no shared identity, no single religion or law code to bind it all together. Ironically, both men died at their peak. Alexander, possibly from fever or poisoning, and Genghis perhaps from a fall off his horse. But who would win if they faced each other on the battlefield? Now let's get to the fantasy showdown everyone wants. Alexander the Great versus Genghis Khan. Who wins if these two military titans actually clash? Surprisingly, Genghis Khan might have given us a hint. According to Persian manuscripts, Genghis Khan studied ancient conquerors obsessively. He learned about Alexander through Muslim scholars and respected his speed and ability to absorb local forces into his army. Genghis even adopted similar rapid march systems and recruitment strategies, but he was critical too. Alexander wasted time on cities, Genghis reportedly said, when he should have chased armies. And there's a legend that he once declared, "Alexander was an eagle, but I am the storm." So who really wins? On open terrain, Genghis dominates. His horse archers would harass and surround Alexander's phalanx before it could engage. On a narrow mountain pass, though, Alexander's disciplined formations and close-quarter tactics would shred Mongol cavalry. But if the war dragged on, Genghis would likely outlast his opponent. He had better logistics, a relay communication system, and a deep spy network. Alexander could win a battle, but Genghis was built for campaigns that crushed entire civilizations. In the end, one was a tactician, the other a strategist. Experts say Alexander wins a battle, but Genghis wins the war. And honestly, that sounds about right. Alexander was the master tactician, Genghis the supreme strategist, one inspired through leadership, the other through discipline. But who do you think was greater? Let us know in the comments below. Here's another video history buffs enjoyed watching. Bye for now. Hitler cheated. His famous Blitzkrieg or lightning war was nothing more than a copycat tactic. He stole the playbook on war from one of the greatest military minds in the world, Napoleon Bonaparte. Hitler thought that the tactic that worked for one of the greatest military leaders in the world would work for him as well. Unfortunately, he failed to realize one fatal flaw. Let's discuss it in today's episode. Long before Hitler was even born, before tanks, bombers, or radio signals, Napoleon Bonaparte was already mastering the art of rapid warfare. He didn't call it Blitzkrieg, but the effect was the same. Move fast, strike hard, and leave your enemy too dazed to react. In 1805 at Ulm, Napoleon didn't win with a glorious battle. He won by simply outmaneuvering his opponent. His army marched faster than anyone thought possible, swung around the Austrian flanks, and boxed them in before they could even figure out what was happening. The result? No major clash, just thousands of Austrians surrendering without firing a shot. Then came Austerlitz. Napoleon pretended to be weak, baited the Allies into attacking him, then turned the tables in a flash. It wasn't brute strength that won the day. It was timing, deception, and hitting where it hurt the most. What made all this possible was something revolutionary for its time: Napoleon's corps system. Instead of one giant blob of an army moving slowly and clumsily, he divided his forces into semi-independent corps, each one capable of fighting on its own, but designed to snap together like a fist when needed. It gave him flexibility, speed, and overwhelming force, exactly when and where he wanted it. Fast forward a century later, and Hitler's generals are flipping through the same playbook, only with tanks and planes instead of horses and muskets. In 1940, when the world expected Germany to attack France head-on, Hitler did what Napoleon might have done. He went around. Instead of smashing into the heavily fortified Maginot Line, German panzers tore through the Ardennes, a forest the French thought was impassable. It was the same strategy Napoleon used when he crossed the Alps to surprise the Austrians at Marengo. Go where the enemy feels safe, hit them where they're unprepared, then move faster than they can think. But Hitler added something Napoleon never had: radios and air power. This let his forces stay in constant communication and coordinate with terrifying precision. German Stuka dive bombers would scream down from the sky just as tanks broke through below, creating shock, awe, and chaos. The result? France collapsed in 6 weeks. The modern world watched in disbelief. But for anyone who had studied Napoleon, it was déjà vu. The tactic worked, at least in the beginning. Before we move on to the next section, please don't forget to subscribe if you liked the video so far. While everyone thought that Hitler was a master war tactician, he was just a student blindly copying his master. And it's this blindness that would lead to his demise in 1945. But for a time, the world thought that Hitler was unstoppable. Before everything fell apart, before Stalingrad and the snow and the smoking ruins of Berlin, Hitler's war machine looked unstoppable. And it was all thanks to one terrifyingly effective strategy: Blitzkrieg. When World War II began in September 1939, the world expected a repeat of the First World War. Trench lines, slow advances, years of grinding stalemates. But Hitler had something else in mind. His first test of Blitzkrieg came in Poland. In just over a month, the country was crushed. German tanks punched through the borders while the Luftwaffe pounded supply lines and railroads. Polish forces, many still relying on cavalry, were overwhelmed before they could even form a proper defense. The world took notice. But Poland was just the warm-up. The real shock came in the spring of 1940. France had one of the largest, best-equipped armies in the world, and they had built a fortress, the Maginot Line, designed to hold back any German invasion. What they didn't expect was that Hitler wouldn't even bother to attack it. Instead, he launched his tanks through the Ardennes, a forest the French had labeled impassable. It wasn't. The German panzers raced through, tore open the Allied lines, and reached the English Channel in just 2 weeks. The French and British were caught in a trap, split and encircled before they could react. Paris fell without a real fight. France surrendered in just 6 weeks, something even Napoleon would have found hard to believe. In Scandinavia, Blitzkrieg proved its flexibility. Hitler sent troops into Denmark and Norway in April 1940. Denmark fell in 6 hours, the shortest military campaign of the war. Norway took longer, but again, speed and coordination ruled the day. Troops landed by sea and air at the same time. No one had seen warfare like this before. Then came the Balkans. In 1941, Hitler turned south. Yugoslavia and Greece had hoped their mountains would protect them. They were wrong. Germany launched a lightning-fast assault. Yugoslavia collapsed in 11 days. Greece fell shortly after, despite British help. German paratroopers even took the island of Crete in a dramatic airborne assault. It was risky, bloody, but successful. No one had ever seized a major island entirely by paratroopers before. And of course, there was North Africa. Rommel, the Desert Fox, used blitzkrieg tactics on open sand. His Afrika Korps moved fast, hit hard, and kept the British on the run for over a year. He didn't have the numbers, but with speed and surprise, he made every tank count. By the summer of 1941, Hitler had conquered most of Europe. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, all crushed in a series of stunning, swift campaigns. Blitzkrieg wasn't just working, it was rewriting the rules of modern war. At that moment, it seemed like Hitler could do no wrong. Blitzkrieg gave him victory after victory, campaign after campaign. But what he didn't realize was that the very strategy he loved so much, the Lightning War, relied on more than just speed and tanks. It relied on the enemy being unprepared, on supply lines staying intact, and on battles being quick. Once any of that started to break down, the whole machine would begin to stall. But in those early years, from 1939 to 1941, Blitzkrieg was the sharpest sword in Hitler's hand, and for a while, no one knew how to stop it. Eventually, the German war machine stopped working because Hitler forgot to account for one simple thing. The main reason Hitler failed is simple. He copied Napoleon's tactics without adapting them for the modern world. He was obsessed with speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, ideas that worked for Napoleon in 1805. But Napoleon adapted to the realities of his time. Hitler didn't. He slapped tanks and planes onto an 1800s playbook and expected it to work everywhere, including Russia. What he didn't grasp was that blitzkrieg only works if your enemy can't recover. France in 1940 couldn't. The Soviet Union could, and did. Their vast land, deep reserves, and industrial strength swallowed Hitler's army whole. Blitzkrieg stalled in the snow, and unlike Napoleon, Hitler refused to adjust, all while neglecting the 3 principles of warface. So why did Napoleon's version of blitzkrieg succeed, while Hitler's collapsed? First, geography. Napoleon fought in Central Europe, where roads were passable and distances between key cities were manageable. His corps could move fast, link up quickly, and keep pressure on the enemy. Hitler tried the same thing, but in the Soviet Union, a country so massive and underdeveloped that movement itself became the enemy. Blitzkrieg depends on speed, but when roads turn to mud and supply lines stretch hundreds of miles, that speed dies. Then there's the opponent. Napoleon faced feudal coalitions, slow-moving aristocratic armies that couldn't respond fast enough. Hitler faced Stalin's USSR, an industrialized, militarized monster with tanks, trains, and factories relocated deep behind the front lines. The Soviets didn't break. They bled, adapted, and came back harder. But maybe the biggest difference? How they handled failure. After the catastrophe of 1812, Napoleon regrouped. He tried to learn from the disaster. It wasn't enough to save his empire, but at least he recognized what went wrong. Hitler didn't. He doubled down. Instead of adapting, he put his faith in so-called miracle weapons. V-2 rockets, jet fighters, anything to avoid facing the truth. He thought technology would save him, while his troops froze and starved in a country too vast to conquer. Both men thought speed would bring victory in Russia. Both were wrong, but only one was willing to ask, why? Hitler copied Napoleon's strategy but ignored the lessons behind it. He saw speed and glory, not the limits. Blitzkrieg works only when the enemy is unprepared, and Hitler found out the hard way that the Soviet Union was anything but. He made the same mistakes: two fronts, broken supply lines, blind ambition, but refused to learn. Napoleon adapted. Hitler didn't. One became a tragic legend, the other a cautionary tale. In the end, history punished the copycat, far more than the original. A bad student copies without understanding. Hitler repeated Napoleon's mistakes and lost even faster. History doesn't forgive those who ignore its lessons. But do you think that if Napoleon had access to tanks and airplanes, would he have conquered all of Europe, maybe even the world? Or would he have made the same fatal mistakes as Hitler? Here's another video history buffs enjoyed watching. Bye for now. Cleopatra was the most beautiful woman in the world. Emperors waged wars for her, and Egypt was flourishing. But was it enough?
They're from Germany. I did not even speak the language.
Approximately 2,000 years later, Catherine showed the world that you don't need beauty and charisma to win. Pure intellect can build an empire and set the world stage for generations to come. But in the end, which queen brought more prosperity to their people? And who ruled men better? Let's discuss it in today's episode of Light's History. From the ancient world to the modern age, few women have captured the imagination like Cleopatra and Catherine the Great. These two queens were not only rulers of vast empires, Egypt and Russia, but also masters of power in a world dominated by men. Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, ruled from 51 to 30 BCE, a time when Rome was the world's superpower. She was more than just a beautiful queen. She was a shrewd politician who used her intelligence, charm, and boldness to influence some of the most powerful men of her time, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. According to historians, Cleopatra spoke several languages and understood the complex politics of Rome better than most of its leaders. Her alliance with Caesar helped her regain the Egyptian throne after a civil war, and later, her romance with Antony was as much a political strategy as it was passion, aimed at maintaining Egypt's independence in the face of growing Roman dominance. Cleopatra's power was legendary, not just because of her relationships, but because she commanded her own army and navy, led battles, and governed one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world. At the height of her rule, Egypt produced nearly 40% of the world's grain supply, a critical asset for the Roman Empire, making Cleopatra's influence over Rome even more vital. Before we move on to the next section, please don't forget to subscribe if you liked the video so far. Catherine the Great ruled Russia from 1762 to 1796 and transformed it into a global superpower. Starting as a German princess with no direct claim to the throne, Catherine seized power after a palace coup and ruled for 34 years, longer than any other Russian female monarch. Under her reign, Russia expanded its borders by over 200,000 square miles, reaching into parts of modern-day Ukraine, Poland, and Crimea. Catherine was also a major patron of the arts and education, bringing the ideas of the Enlightenment to Russia. Yet, much like Cleopatra, Catherine's personal relationships were a key part of her political strategy. She maintained a series of powerful lovers, often elevating them to high positions in the government and military. These men were not just companions, but political allies who helped her control the sprawling and often turbulent Russian court. Historians note that Catherine corresponded with European philosophers such as Voltaire and Diderot, showing her sharp intellect and political savvy beyond her romantic ties. Despite ruling a far more complex and vast empire, Catherine used the art of influence to keep powerful men loyal, balancing love, power, and politics with remarkable skill. So here we are, looking at two women separated by nearly 2,000 years, but united by their exceptional ability to rule both empires and the men within them. Cleopatra and Catherine the Great both ruled through influence over powerful men, but their strategies and philosophies on leadership were distinct, reflecting their personalities and the political worlds they navigated. To understand these differences, let's look at one key example from each queen's life. For Cleopatra, her relationship with Julius Caesar perfectly illustrates her ruling style. When Cleopatra was fighting for her throne, Egypt was in chaos. Instead of relying solely on armies or traditional power, she used personal charm and political savvy. Legend says she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence wrapped in a carpet, a dramatic move to make a memorable first impression. Cleopatra knew that winning Caesar's loyalty meant securing her reign and Egypt's independence. This encounter wasn't just romance. It was a calculated act of seduction as diplomacy. She relied on emotional connection and personal influence to rule through the men around her, turning them into protectors and allies. Her philosophy was clear. Ruling men meant captivating them with charm and intelligence, creating loyalty through personal bonds that translated into political power. Catherine the Great's way of ruling men was more structured and strategic, best seen in her handling of Grigory Potemkin. Potemkin was one of her most trusted lovers and political allies. But unlike Cleopatra's often emotionally charged relationships, Catherine's partnership with Potemkin was pragmatic and political. She appointed him to lead military campaigns, govern territories, and manage court affairs, knowing that his success would strengthen her rule.
Sparsely populated, they were settled by Russian colonists under the supervision of Prince Potemkin, Catherine's advisor and lover.
Catherine's philosophy was to build a network of loyal men who owed their power directly to her. She managed these relationships like pieces on a chessboard, promoting, balancing, and sometimes discarding them to maintain control. Potemkin's loyalty wasn't born just of affection, but of political necessity, and Catherine used this to expand Russia's borders and modernize her empire. In short, Cleopatra ruled through seductive diplomacy and personal loyalty, making men feel they were part of her emotional and political world. Catherine ruled through calculated alliances and political control, building a power structure where men's ambitions were tied to her authority. These examples show two different philosophies, one ruled by heart and charm, the other by mind and strategy. When we look back at the legacies of Cleopatra and Catherine the Great, we see two very different outcomes, not just for their empires, but for the men who lived under their rule. Under Cleopatra, men lived in a world charged with passion and drama. Her court was a place where loyalty was won through personal connection and emotional bonds. Men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just political partners. They were lovers, allies, and sometimes pawns in a highly charged political game. Cleopatra's reign, however, was marked by constant conflict and uncertainty, ultimately ending in the fall of Egypt's independence and the suicides of both Cleopatra and Antony. For the men around her, life was volatile, high risk, and deeply intertwined with her powerful charisma. Cleopatra inspired devotion and fierce loyalty, but her reign didn't bring lasting stability for Egypt or for the men who served her. Meanwhile, Catherine's rule was the complete opposite. But was it good enough for historians to call her a better leader? Want to understand the world better? Start with history and subscribe to our channel. Catherine the Great ruled over a far larger and more complex empire, and men under her reign often benefited from the stability and reforms she implemented. Catherine's Russia was a place where nobles, generals, and advisors could rise through merit and loyalty, often rewarded with land, titles, and power, provided they aligned with her vision. Men lived in a more ordered society, one where loyalty was transactional but steady. Catherine's pragmatic alliances created an environment where men could thrive within a system that promised rewards for service and obedience. When we ask who was the better leader, the battle between seduction and intellect leans heavily in favor of intellect. Catherine's pragmatic, strategic mind ensured a longer, more stable reign and a stronger empire. Cleopatra's brilliance and charm made her a legendary figure, but her emotional leadership style was less able to secure lasting power against the rising Roman juggernaut. In the end, Cleopatra ruled through heart and personal allure, creating intense but fragile bonds with powerful men. Catherine ruled through intellect and political mastery, building a durable system where men's ambitions were aligned with her authority. The better leader was Catherine the Great, who showed that while seduction can win battles of influence, intellect wins the long war of empire building. Modern leaders can learn from both Cleopatra and Catherine the Great by blending emotional intelligence with strategic thinking. Cleopatra's ability to forge deep personal connections shows the power of charisma and persuasion in building loyalty, skills useful in diplomacy, business, and leadership today. Catherine's legacy teaches the importance of long-term vision, calculated alliances, and system building. Today's most effective leaders use charm to inspire, but intellect to govern. Whether leading a company, a country, or a movement, success comes from knowing when to win hearts and when to move pieces on the board with cold, strategic precision. The best leaders master both. But do you think that if Napoleon had access to tanks and airplanes, would he have conquered all of Europe, maybe even the world? Or would he have made the same fatal mistakes as Hitler? Here's another video history buffs enjoyed watching. Bye for now.